Is it dead? Is the Science Congress dead?
Yes, actually it is. It was never formally said so by the government.
But there was one political leader who did not ever visit the Science Congress, Mahatma Gandhi.
He was famously anti-science.
Was he
put it back.
anti-science?
Very much.
This was founded by Professor J.L. Simonsen. He goes back. He
All
spends-
Simons go back.
All Simons go back. What was the significance of this coming at the moment that it did? Welcome to the Rearview. I'm Shobhana K. Nair.
And I am Jacob Koshi.
So far, we have brought you stories about the great men and women of Indian science. We have even brought you stories about the scandals from the annals of Indian science history. We have given you episodes of interesting phenomena. We have even spoken about various institutions. But today, we're going to discuss the story of a platform that brought together the Indian science community. Yes, I'm talking about the Indian Science Congress. Long before independence and long before we forged a identity as a nation, the Indian Science Congress brought the entire community on one platform. And Robert Anderson, a historian, a science historian, he has argued that the Indian Science Congress Association was the first recognition of India's independence. So the reason why we are doing this episode is a news report that Jacob recently wrote and an event that Jacob recently attended.
It's called the Emerging Science, Technology and Innovation Conclave. Its first edition happened just on the 3rd of November. And it was significant because it was bandied as a meeting point for Indian as well as international technologists, scientists, innovators to come and discuss the future of Indian science and technology. But that's all very blah in one sense, because there are several such meetings that happen. But more significantly, it is a kind of replacement of the traditional Indian Science Congress. And the Indian Science Congress was the original forum where, such meetings happened. But as we will describe, it has had a steady fall in relevance, grandeur, and after that, even, significance to Indian science at all. And the death of its demise has been coming in for quite some time.
I know. I was reading your stories. You've
Yeah.
been writing about its anticipated demise since 2013
At
or
least, yeah.
even before.
A little before that too,
Yeah.
But that was when it really, because that was the 2013, as you mentioned, was the centenary year of the Indian Science Congress, and there was this rather scathing article by the then director of the Indian Institute of Science, Professor P, and where he had questioned the relevance of this of the Indian Science Congress. And since then,
In very colorful language.
yeah, and
Do you want to read his quote?
this is what he wrote in The Current Science. Few practicing scientists of note consider the Congress as an important event. Pomp and ceremony take precedence over substance. Over the years, the Congress has been reduced to an occasion where the inaugural session appears to be the raison d'etre for the meeting. So, and that was very much even my experience of it. I mean, I've covered several of these congresses. It's always held in a different city. It was always held in the first week of January. And traditionally, it was the first, event that the Prime Minister of India always attended at the beginning of a calendar year. So it had that traditional gravitas. It was a precedent set by Jawaharlal Nehru, and no prime ministers really deviated from that. But that was the main event, and as Prof. Balram says, once that happened, everything just started to fall into disarray, and then there would be instances of some Nobel laureates, international, sometimes several of them coming, and it was interesting. It has its own charm, but science was no longer the
centerpiece
of the
The
3 or 4.
event.
It was usually held over four
Okay,
days.
so before we get into its story, first let's establish, is it dead? Is the Science Congress dead?
Yes, actually it is, because there has been no science congress since 2020, and that was, of course, the pandemic year. But uh, there was always it was never formally said so by the government. So how it works is, the Indian Science Congress is organized by a Calcutta based organization called the Indian Science Congress Association, which has its long history. But currently, it over the years, the Indian Science Congress Association is supported by the Department of Science and Technology in terms of funding, and has been so forever. Its only job as an organization was to hold a science congress. And over the years, there has been this, especially since 2015, there has been this tussle between the DST and the ISCA over having a greater say on on the kind of event, on the kind of sessions that are organized, and precipitated by these editorials and discussions by like Professor Balarams, because it was not he was not just this lone voice. He's been somebody who's been echoing the voice of many prominent scientists who have been saying this, and many of them actually had stopped going for its sessions unless they were explicitly committed to or invited. And it has been the slow kind of death. And this was the first time, in fact, that, I mean, we've not had a science congress for 3 years at least, but there was always this expectation that it would revive. But with the announcement and the actual uh, uh, commissioning of the ESTIC,
Which
the
is?
Emerging Science Technology Innovation Conclave. Note, the word innovation has now come in, and it's a conclave, and there's no longer Indian and science. It's expanded beyond that.
Who are the organizers of this?
There's no specific association. It is a joint effort. It is primarily by the Department of Science and Technology,
Okay.
but they would give,
So they
every
would
year it'll be
basically-
taken over by some other ministry would take charge. And that's been the practice now for many of these science conclaves that are now being held by the government. Like one among the science ministries takes yearly ownership of, or leadership in terms of organizing this event. So there is no real science congress association that used, which was entrusted the responsibility. That is gone. Now they're apparently fighting some internal court case with the DST, which is a different sordid story that's going on. We'll never have the kind of the kind of interest, the history, or the origin stories of science.
Gravitas, basically, because it doesn't have that long tail of.
And it'll probably take 100 years
for it to.
yeah.
So we'll put a pin in the controversy, and we'll come back to that. Let's go back to the beginning of the Indian Science Congress. So the first Science Congress was presided over by Ashutosh Mukherjee.
Yeah, the doyen of Indians,
Indian-
the Asiatic Society, etc.
Yeah, and also a great mathematician,
Yes.
is what I've been told. And it was
We've referenced him, as the person who kind of, whom C.V. Raman kind of discovered, as, he led the Indian Association of the Cultivation of Sciences in Kolkata. And it wasn't his institution that Raman just walked by into this dusty room.
Yes. So the year was 1914. India was obviously still under colonial rule. Scientific practice was not yet institutionalized, as you said. And more importantly, there were no journals, which were still rare. And in this context, Indian Science Congress was born. The first meeting was held from 15th January to 17th January 1914 at the Asiatic Society in Calcutta, presided over by Ashutosh Mukherjee, who was then the Vice Chancellor of the Calcutta University. And it brought together 105 scientists, Indian scientists, and 35 papers across 6 sections: botany, chemistry, ethnography, geology, physics, and zoology were presented. And this was founded by Professor J.L. Simonsen. Simonsen. I'm sorry, I have to crack this joke. This name.
Oh, you mean
This-
Kolkata and Simon?
This name lends itself. So
And he's in the Simon who is going back, right? Did he eventually go back to?
Wait, hold on. Our viewers don't know the story. So why am I calling? So he's Bengali by association,
By
one must say.
association.
J.L. Simonsen. He had deep interest in Indian science, and he is the sort of the originator of the Indian Science Congress, forming this platform. But he goes back.
Yeah.
He
All Simons
spends
go back.
all Simons go back. This one also does. So Simonson was an English organic chemist who worked in India, and he contributed. He studied the chemistry of many plant extracts. He was in fact also knighted in 1949. He died in 1957. In 1907, he became a professor lecturer in Manchester. And later he came down to Presidency College, Madras in 1910. And when the First World War broke out, Simonson stayed back in India. And he was an oil controller and advisor to the Indian Munitions Board. And it was during his stay in India in 1914. So imagine the man has been here in India for only 4 years, and he comes up with this Indian Science Congress Association, and he remained its secretary till 1926.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he was assisted, I mean, as the records of the ISCA show, he was assisted by another organic chemist called P.S. MacMahon. And unlike Simonson, there is almost no, I couldn't find anything in, even not even even routine about MacMahon. I mean, if the curious listener, if she wants to find out more about MacMahon, might find P.S. MacMahon, the mathematician, who was at Cambridge, our our former interesting Mr. G.H. R's contemporary. He makes an appearance in The Man Who Knew Infinity as the person who challenges Ramanujan with all that big mathematics. So, but it's not that MacMahon. This is another very staid organic chemist. And there's also very little, I mean, there's practically nothing about what he actually did, what were his, his kinds of contributions to the society. But the point is, his name is kind of wedded with that of Simonson in the commencement of the Indian Science Congress Association.
Why did we need, like, what? I mean, one does understand that, yes, it does build a community, it does a Congress brings people together, and physically, when you meet each other, you will be bouncing ideas. But what was the significance of this coming at the moment that it did?
It was very, because in today, it might be that, okay, this was just another meeting ground where, there was, they had their stuffy kind of meetings and their sessions. But it is so significant because this was a time when everything that we take for granted regarding the practice of science and technology, for example, the fact that universities are the places where research happens, professors and specialists in various science subjects are actually, they come, they share papers, they write articles. These are all accepted facts about how science happens. But this was at a time when none of this was basic. Universities were just mere examination centers. They never did any teaching or research of their own. And there
Also,
was
I guess back then, without internet, this was the only fora where you could share papers, right? Present your research.
absolutely. I mean, of course, there were there were the journals like the Proceedings of the Royal Society, etc. But even as for example, even somebody like C.V. Raman, before they would actually send their research papers for peer review to the established journals of the time, it was not uncommon for people to actually announce their findings to a public audience or an audience of semi experts. So it was an era where people would talk about scientific work more generally and more openly, because it was not as organized. It was yet to become the organized infrastructure or the practice that it today is. So they took inspiration from something like the British Association for the Advancement of Science. And the formation of scientific societies. I mean, the original was, of course, the Royal Society of London, of Newton, etc., of their fame. And that was the beginning of how science started, where people, and all usually always men, would just gather around and share their their discoveries or their thoughts and ideas about nature and the scientific world. So it was taken as a given that for, and this was India, Bengal, which was kind of emulating the English practices of the dissemination and the practice of science and technology. So it was deemed necessary,
not just in science,
but among the other things, of course,
Calcutta
everything
has
else.
a
Calcutta's, as we have
famous
discussed,
heritage of aping the
yes, in all these
the-
matters, and therefore, just
the-
as in English education and all of the other things were happening.
No, also,
You had
Jacob,
to-
importantly, because at this point, at least here in India, most of the Indian scientists were amateurs. They were either army officers or they were civil servants. And as we've discussed in one of our early episodes
trigonometry survey.
in trigonometry survey, not just in the Indian meteorological department, on how our initial officers of the IMD were actually
They were like civil servants
who were
This was
also
their side.
collecting
Yeah.
data on
It's like how a contemporary bureaucrat might have interest in painting, or suddenly after they finish they're holding exhibitions
So
of
I
their.
guess for a bunch of amateurs, it is even more essential to have a conclave of
Because this
the
was also
top.
the time when science was very much like a curiosity driven enterprise. There is very little organized state support for scientific investigation. So, and it was then as like Sir Ashutosh Mukherjee and ML Sarkar, all of these people who now were kind of convinced that for the advancement of science in India, it was necessary to have some kind of organization, and where people could, these amateur experts, would be able to bounce ideas off each other. And
Yeah. And it had important milestones. So you had in 1915, for example, the second year of the Science Congress, C.V. Raman presenting his work on acoustics. And in 1920,
which was his work, which was far more, which was his first foray into science before he got into all the light scattering.
I think even before he officially sort of took on the academics path. He also in 1929 demonstrated the light scattering, a precursor to his Nobel winning work. And in 1920, you had the great chemist P.C. Ray, who presided over the Science Congress. And I want to read a bit about what Ray had to say. And again, this is thanks to the Hindu library that they have pulled out this ancient newspaper clippings. And
How ancient are these?
at 1920,
Okay.
I'm quoting from a piece written on printed on 13th January 1920. This is P.C. Ray's address to the Science Congress, the opening.
Maybe we should just
address.
tell people who, for those not in the know, P.C. Ray, Prafulla Chandra Ray, is the father of Indian chemistry. He was one of the first scientists come chemistry entrepreneurs who actually set up the Bengal pharmaceutical production factory. And he also had a very prominent role in the sense that he also brought to light ancient Indian knowledge in terms of what was actually discovered about chemicals and metals, what was actually known in Indian history prior to the Britishers.
That's just a small trailer
Absolutely.
of a full-length episode lying ahead.
There are so many of these
on
episodes.
PC Ray. I think when we run out of ideas, we should just go back and look at our own episodes because we keep coming up with these ideas anyhow.
Anyway, so that's PC Ray. Yeah.
So that's PC Ray. And here's what PC Ray had to say in his opening address presiding over the Science Congress. He he, in fact, was very angry with the British for stepmotherly treatment to the Indian scientific community. And he thundered from the podium at the Science Congress and he said, the World War called for every ounce of scientific knowledge and effort. Scientific battles have been fought by laboratory men. Indeed, it was from nitrogen of the air out of which Germany manufactured synthetic nitric acid and thus defied the world for 4 years and more in spite of the stringency of the blockade.
Yeah.
It is now becoming abundantly clear that the fate of a nation will henceforth depend more upon the achievements of its students of science than upon the skill of its generals or adroitness of its diplomats and statesmen.
So it's just like Indian leaders started to assert their their independence or their need to evolve as a distinct identity in the political space, in the scientific space also. It was people like PC Ray who started asserting for Indian scientists being being a particular class that ought to benefit on more equal terms
So,
from the general benefits of science.
yeah, but and he was equally angry because he said, "Where does India stand in this formidable world competition?
Yeah.
Nowhere. British officers occupied the scientific positions, and they would use India to gather information and leave for their country." To read history is such an humbling experience because when we began this episode, I was giving you credit that you've been anticipating the demise of the Indian Science Congress since 2013 or before. But let me tell you, and that the Hindu editorial way back in 1920 itself was slamming the Indian Science Congress and its inadequacy.
And I've been slamming it even before I was with the Hindu. So it's a
So,
consistent.
the Hindu editorial on the 1920 Science Congress argued that Congress can't be just a place to compare notes and collate each other's experience. To consider that function alone to be all and end all of the Congress is seems to us to take a too narrow a view of its functions. So instead, the newspaper argued that the Congress should undertake the task of ensuring a scientific outlook for the students and in the elementary as well as secondary school. So basically, come down from the high horse of pure sciences and maybe, but that is a conflict that has always dogged.
Even now, I mean, even if you look at, so this whole reference to the inaugural address, it's usually by the prime minister, or even in the pre-independent era, as you said, there would be eminent scientists. It has always been this: how do you ensure that India's scientific workforce is able to use science for the benefit of the masses? Because every year it was always very, it was always very telling that, the benefits of science, because there was so much aura about scientific discovery, especially in those, in the early 20th century. There was so much aura as if it is going to magically transform and solve everything from poverty. But it never seemed to reflect adequately enough on, on the ground in India. And you always have the important, prime minister or somebody exhorting scientists to do more, giving these like kind of veiled snipes or, cajoling to
And nobody
do
is
something.
very different. Even
Yeah,
in
it's been, even today. I mean, even when Prime Minister Modi spoke at the ESTIC, it was again, scientists should use their know-how to improve the lot of the farmers, etc.
So the other interesting thing that I feel is the extreme political influence on Science Congress.
Very much.
It also becomes a platform for contestation, political contestations of various things. But there was one political leader who did not ever visit the Science Congress, Mahatma Gandhi. He
He was famously anti-science.
Was
Let's
he
put it back. Very much.
anti-science,
Because he
or
was,
was he just,
no, because he always,
or did he have a finer, nuanced position on
well,
science?
it was very evident because he was always somebody who was against the use of science and technology towards the creation of state, because he believed that it was technological. It was technology had a very very major role in disrupting, the fabric of of communities. For example, how handloom weavers would be out of a job in the face of the power loom. So he was very distrustful in general of the role of big science, and that was all. The early 20th century was all just big science, and he was against industrialization, which was very much the position.
So, all the prime ministers' prescriptions have been more or less similar. Uh, in 1963, Jawaharlal Nehru addressed the Science Congress,
It was the
and
50th
this was the 50th
edition
Science Congress,
at
and he
Allahabad.
warned the scientists that they should get out of this governmental way of working, to
Because
break
by this
out.
time already science had become a very, for the lack of a better word, a sarkari way of functioning, where we have discussed
Yeah.
our NPL and all of the previous instances in the Department of Atomic Energy, etc., where scientists were just they just saw it their role as just another job and going to office, and it was underwhelming in terms of
But
its potential for science.
that is actually very interesting because it is it, Nehru's opinion. Nehru was always an optimist, and
Very much.
when it comes to science, also, his commitment towards the Science Congress, he was deeply committed
Always, very much.
towards the National Science Congress, Indian Science Congress. And in fact, I just want to contrast what he said in 1963 to what he said in 1938. He wanted to attend the Science Congress, but he couldn't. And this is again from the Hindu archives. And he said, the Indian Science Congress represents science, and the science is the spirit of the age and the dominating factor of the modern world. So he was very sort of dewy eyed about the Indian Science Congress in 38. But by the time he takes charge as the prime minister towards the last
Yeah.
a year or so of his prime ministership, he is getting disenchanted because the Indian Science Congress seems to not be producing results as much as he would love.
Yeah.
For
And it's also, by this time, there have been changes in the tenor of Indian science. See, because by now journals and all of these are established, modes of scientific communication. So the science congress, the early science congresses, for instance, were held very much in the big cities, on the relatively big cities, the Bombay, Madras, Punjab has had a couple of instances, but over time it started to branch out into the smaller cities. The whole point was to take science to the masses. So you hold it in tier 2 towns, tier 3 towns, as you would call them, you would refer to them now, so that more people come into it in a manner of curiosity. You have, you have university students, you have school students who would come, and the idea was that, they would be enthrall of great scientists, holding forth and, be attracted towards careers in
So,
science.
two things you need to talk before we wrap up this episode. One is your experience of attending this science congress, and as we were just talking about how they were herd in these Nobel Prize winners and then put them in the safe enclosure where only the high and mighty interacted.
So that kind of
What
was-
exactly, like?
So that kind of was what it descended into. I came into all of this fully in the 2000s, obviously. And what used to happen, for example, there would always, the Indian Science Congress Association would keep an eye out for who was the available international Nobel laureate, because India had already stopped producing Nobel laureates in science a long time back.
Yeah.
So the point was to reach out to them, and Nobel laureates in general, once they become Nobel laureates, do spend a considerable amount of their time, traveling around the world and talking about
Yeah,
their
they're
work,
in such
etc.
demand.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it was always a scramble for getting these Nobel laureates and, have them, fly them over business class, put them up in the best, five-star hotels.
Mhm.
And, wherever the Science Congress was organized, there would be this big enclosures where, these laureates would always be herded into some kind of a, cordoned off area.
Hmm.
And there would be this, they would give this nice lecture,
Hmm.
but rarely, it was very difficult. It was not easy for anybody, a young scientist or a young student, to just walk up to them and, or, even attend these lectures. So it became very much like a celebrity mela. In fact, this was what provoked the ire of Venki Ramakrishnan, the 2019 chemistry laureate. And he actually uh, expressed his discomfort very, very visibly. He actually called the Indian Science Congress a circus, and he apparently, because he had attended it in 2015 and it was all very chaotic for him. And this guy is, I mean, he's done his masters in India. He's familiar with the Indian milieu, but then he spent many, many years in the US and, in the UK. And he's president of the Royal Society.
Where the structures are not so tightly hierarchical.
No,
It's not
that is
about.
already, I mean, it's a
Yeah.
culture. This is a culture that has long evaporated from
Yeah.
this thing. The Royal Society is a very staid kind of organization. It
Whereas
doesn't
we
have
are
this very,
still surring and miming
yeah. And
people.
there have been defenses. People
Hmm.
have said that, well, in to stay relevant, the Indian Science Congress is not just a place where people come and discuss their cutting edge science.
Hmm.
It is supposed to be, public facing. It is supposed to be like this event where people, it provokes curiosity about science.
Also, I believe now that we have all these journals and or we have all these online platforms and we have other avenues to discuss ideas, the such a conclave loses its importance, right?
Absolutely. And that is why it has been, it is, and the Science Congress Association did not exactly work towards, keeping up with the
With
times
the
and becoming
times.
more contemporary. I mean, we never have the equivalent of a Royal Society, for instance, which is what it should have been, but it
Ended
never
up
became.
being.
I mean, we have different scientific academies.
Huh.
So there's always been this thing that, why doesn't one of the academies take over the functioning of this? It'll give it more heft and gravitas, but politics at various levels have always impeded this.
The Indian Science Congress have often been the platform for political contestations also. And if the opposition is to be believed, they claim that post 2014, it has become more so that absurd ideas with little scientific basis have been presented here to legitimize them.
So this was, since 2015 was a very legendary science congress. Legendary, I mean, in a sense of infamy, which happened in the university. It was organized in the University of Bombay in 2015, and this was the first science congress when, following the BJP government actually taking over. And in 2015, there was this one scientific talk that was given by um, a man who called himself an engineer called Anand Bodas.
Okay.
So he had
I
this.
love the way that you're saying one man who called himself
It was
engineer.
because I remember seeing him because it was this talk which was this, in one of the, in one of those college room things, and, he had this long flowing white hair, and suddenly he had this talk on, how in Vedic times they had already invented spacecrafts, and how, Indian
Oh
people
yes,
had
I remember
invented
that. It in
bomber
fact,
planes, and
yeah.
this was all. And that was a time when, in fact, Prakash Javadekar was one of the dignitaries at the Science Congress. And it was quite a scandal at that point of time, because all this was 2015. Remember, this was when
There
people
was
were
a
talking.
Bollywood film also on this
Absolutely. And
episode.
those are all the
Yeah.
innocent days when people thought that, all of these things would be poo-pooed. But this was exactly what people were
Yeah.
worried about. That is this scientific cultural conversation that was always there at the back, that was associated with the RSS and the BJP. which they thought was anti-science and pseudoscience. This actually made it was the first time that a science congress would discuss something like this, and it was like a big moment. And this was only the first of these instances. In other congresses, for instance, there have been people who've held forth on very outrageous claims, like, for instance, the Kauravas were an example of of stem cell engineering. So all of
Because
these
you
were,
had 100 Kauravas.
yeah, and they were all actually born of stem cells thing. And Lord Ganesh was
That
some,
was the first one. Was that the
they
first?
were all around the same, they were
No,
all
but
around the same time.
that was in Prime Minister Narendra Modi's
Yes, that was
address
his.
to a science
No, that was
congress
not
where.
that was
No.
not at a science congress, but it was repeated again by a vice chancellor of of Hyderabad University.
Oh.
So all of these started, and it was again, and Venki Ramakrishnan actually, when he called it a circus, was speaking in this. He too was there at the 2015 Congress where this happened, and he just it. So it this really, ironically, this actually started out this this discussion by the DST, the Department of Science and Technology, which is the main funder of. I mean, they started to feel that the organizers of the Science Congress Association were being too lax and loose with, with not having a good policy in place to uh, vet on the kind of speakers who would be coming in. So the repetition of this, ironically, during started to fast go downhill, and it started coming to a stage when they actually then refused. They said that unless and until the DST has a greater role in the say proceedings of the organization of the Congress, they would not fund it. And then the Science Congress Association filed a lawsuit, and there was it all kind of started getting very
It
very
was like the
antagonistic.
pieces of dominoes were falling
The
one by
falling.
one.
And then COVID happened, and then after a point, it started with the prime minister stopped physically attending the congress,
And
in
started
the
to.
inaugural address,
Yeah.
virtual. And it also, I mean, there's also COVID time, that was the time when all of these things became normalized, and he stopped coming physically to the congresses. Till one congress, there was no congress at all. It was, the dates were postponed. And finally, just last year, in 2024, there was this note by the Department of Science and Technology saying that they would no longer be, you know they would no longer fund or host, sponsor this, this congress. And then we hear of of the announcement of the ESTI,
Emerging Science,
technology.
Technology, and Innovation Conclave.
Con-
So, but we have to remember, for a century, beginning from 1914 till
yeah,
as recently as 24. I mean, not 24, but
till 2020 at
till
least,
at least to
2019.
2020, we had one single platform, the Indian Science Congress, which sort of took the scientists together. For all its flaws, for all its problems, it did build a scientific community.
Very much. So it is something that will always remain. Nobody will ever, because there have been sociological analysis of the ISCA, all the people it has been associated. Anybody in the history of science has been associated with the Science Congress. So its legacy cannot ever go away. And when people talk about the history of science in India, there's no way you can not mention the role that the ISCA played. But as we've always been discussing, history has its twists and turns, but what it does is the future keeps evolving, and we have to just keep our eyes out for what new turn comes next. So that's all we have in this episode. Thank you for watching. I'm Jacob Koshi.
I'm Shobna K. Nair. See you the next time.